I stood perfectly still in the center of the extravagant, ridiculously overpriced country club banquet hall, the heavy crystal glass in my hand suddenly feeling like an anchor. Around me, 50 of my closest relatives were completely silent, their eyes darting between me, my weeping mother, and my younger sister who was currently doing her absolute best to look like a tragic, helpless victim. The air in the room was thick with tension, smelling faintly of expensive prime rib and cheap, suffocating perfume. For 28 years, I had played the role of the dutiful, quiet, unproblematic daughter. I had swallowed every insult, accepted every scrap plan, and nodded along every time my parents told me that my sister just needed a little more help, a little more patience, a little more of my money. But looking at them now, as my father held a microphone and publicly demanded that I hand over the keys to the house I had spent a decade saving for something, inside me finally snapped. It wasn't a loud, explosive break. It was a quiet, profound realization that the family I had spent my entire life bleeding for did not love me. They never had. And as I looked at their expectant, entitled faces, I realized I was finally ready to let them lose the only child who had ever truly cared about them. To understand the absolute audacity of what my parents were demanding, you have to understand the nightmare of a shadow I grew up in. My sister Haley is 3 years younger than me, and from the moment she was born, she was the undisputed center of our family's universe. Haley was the golden child, a title she carried with a sickeningly sweet smile and an absolute refusal to ever take responsibility for her own actions. While I was the quiet, observant kid who preferred reading in the corner, Haley was loud, demanding, and constantly in need of an audience. My parents worshipped the ground she walked on. If Haley wanted something, the earth had to stop spinning until she got it. I remember being 12 years old and saving up my allowance for an entire year to buy a specific, slightly used mountain bike I had seen in a neighbor's garage. I did extra chores, mowed lawns, and hoarded every penny. The day I finally bought it, I was glowing with pride. 2 days later, Haley threw a massive tantrum because she wanted a bike too. Instead of telling her to save up like I did, my parents simply took my bike and gave it to her, telling me that I was older and needed to learn how to share. When she left it in the driveway a week later and my father accidentally ran it over with his car, they didn't buy me a new one. They bought her a new one to make up for the trauma of seeing the crushed metal. That was the blueprint for my entire life. As we grew older, the disparity in how we were treated only widened into a gaping chasm. I worked my way through high school, bagging groceries and tutoring younger kids so I could afford to apply to college. I got accepted into a prestigious culinary arts program, a dream I had held onto since I was a little girl baking bread with my grandmother. When I proudly showed my parents the acceptance letter, my mother barely glanced at it before telling me that they couldn't afford to help me with tuition because Haley had just decided she wanted to go to a highly exclusive, obscenely expensive private boarding school for the arts. They drained their savings, took out loans, and sent her away to pursue her talent, leaving me to take on a mountain of student debt and work night shifts at a diner to keep myself afloat. I didn't complain. I put my head down, worked 80-hour weeks, and built a life out of sheer, unadulterated grit. I started a small catering business out of a rented commercial kitchen, slowly building a client list, upgrading my equipment, and eventually opening my own high-end bakery and event catering company in the city. I was successful, but I was quiet about it. I drove a reliable used sedan, wore simple clothes, and lived in a modest apartment. Because I never asked them for money and never flaunted what I had, my parents assumed I was just scraping by. Haley, on the other hand, was a walking disaster dressed in designer clothes. She dropped out of the private art school after a year, claiming the instructors were jealous of her vision. She then bounced from one expensive, parent-funded whim to another. She wanted to be a fashion designer, so my parents bought her $10,000 worth of sewing equipment that sat untouched in their basement. She wanted to be an influencer, so they funded her lavish trips to Bali and Dubai so she could take pictures for her 3,000 followers. She racked up credit card debt like it was an Olympic sport, and every single time the bill came due, my parents bailed her out. They co-signed her luxury apartment, they paid for her brand new SUV, and they constantly fed her the delusion that she was just one viral moment away from becoming a millionaire. They enabled her into complete functional paralysis. She was 25 years old, completely incapable of holding down a job, and deeply, deeply convinced that the world owed her a life of luxury. The real trouble started about 6 months ago. After years of relentless saving, strict budgeting, and working through holidays and weekends, I finally reached my ultimate goal. I bought a house. It wasn't a massive mansion, but it was a beautiful, historic 4-bedroom home with a wraparound porch, a massive plot of land, and most importantly, a stunning, newly renovated chef's kitchen. It was my sanctuary. I closed on the house quietly, not wanting to make a big deal out of it. I planned to invite my parents over for a nice dinner once I was fully unpacked to show them what I had built. I wanted, just for once in my life, for them to walk into my home and tell me they were proud of me. I wanted them to see that the daughter they had ignored had built something beautiful out of nothing. But the universe and my family had completely different plans. A week before my planned dinner, my mother called me in an absolute panic. She was sobbing so hard into the phone I could barely understand her. She told me to come over to their house immediately, saying it was a family emergency of the highest order. My heart dropped into my stomach. I left my bakery in the middle of a massive wedding prep, terrified that someone was dying or hurt. I broke the speed limit getting to my parents' suburban home, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. When I burst through their front door, breathless and panicked, I found my mother, my father, and Haley sitting around the kitchen table. Nobody was bleeding. Nobody was dying. In fact, Haley was casually scrolling through her phone, sipping on an iced coffee. I stopped in the doorway, my adrenaline crashing into a wave of profound confusion and immediate anger. I demanded to know what was going on. My father sighed heavily, rubbing his temples, and gestured for me to sit down. He looked at me with a solemn, grave expression. He explained that Haley had hit a rough patch. Her influencer career hadn't taken off, and her sponsors had dropped her. Because she hadn't paid her rent in 6 months, her landlord had evicted her. And because my parents had co-signed the lease, they were now on the hook for tens of thousands of dollars in back rent and damages, which they couldn't afford to pay. Haley was officially homeless, completely broke, and drowning in debt. I sat there, trying to process the information, but honestly, I wasn't surprised. It was the inevitable conclusion to years of unchecked financial recklessness. I took a deep breath and told them I was sorry they were dealing with this, but asked why this required me abandoning my business in the middle of the day. My mother leaned forward, her eyes wide with desperate intensity. She told me that they had found a solution to the problem, but they needed my help to execute it. She then dropped the bomb. She said they had heard through my aunt that I had recently purchased a large 4-bedroom house in the suburbs. She said it was a massive stroke of luck and a true blessing from above. She told me, without a single shred of hesitation or irony, that I needed to let Haley move into my new house. Not into a guest room. Not for a few weeks. She wanted me to give Haley the master bedroom, allow her to live there rent-free indefinitely, and cover all of her living expenses so she could have a stable environment to focus on her mental health and relaunch her brand. I stared at them, absolutely speechless. The silence in the kitchen stretched out for a full minute as my brain desperately tried to compute the sheer insanity of what they were asking. I looked at Haley, who finally put her phone down and gave me a pathetic, practiced pout. She told me that she was just so stressed, and my house would be the perfect content studio for her new lifestyle vlog. I looked back at my parents, waiting for the punchline, waiting for them to say it was a joke, but they were dead serious. They were asking me to turn the home I had bled for into a free luxury resort for the sister who had never worked a day in her life. I found my voice, and it was shaking with a rage I didn't know I was capable of. I told them no. Absolutely, unequivocally no. I explained that I had worked for 10 years to buy that house, that it was my private space, and that I was not going to enable Haley's behavior by letting her live with me rent-free while I continued to work 80-hour weeks to support her. The reaction was instantaneous and explosive. My mother gasped as if I had slapped her across the face. My father slammed his fist on the table, rattling the coffee cups. He called me a selfish, ungrateful brat. He told me that family takes care of family, and that I had a moral obligation to help my sister in her time of need. He screamed that I was a single woman who didn't need a 4-bedroom house, and that I was hoarding space and resources while my own flesh and blood was suffering. The argument escalated into a full-blown screaming match. Haley started crying real theatrical tears, wailing that I had always hated her and that I wanted to see her on the streets. My mother accused me of buying the house just to rub it in Haley's face, a claim so deeply illogical it made my head spin. They threw every manipulative tactic in the book at me. They guilt-tripped me about how they had clothed and fed me as a child, completely ignoring the fact that providing basic necessities is the legal requirement of being a parent. They told me I was cold, heartless, and a terrible sister. But I refused to break. I stood up, told them that Haley could get a job at a grocery store and rent a studio apartment like a normal adult, and walked out the front door. That was just the beginning of the nightmare. Over the next month, my life became a living hell of escalating conflict. My parents launched a full-scale smear campaign against me. They called every aunt, uncle, and cousin in our extended family, spinning a tragic tale of how I had become a wealthy, greedy monster who was happily watching my sister starve. My phone was inundated with text messages from relatives I hadn't spoken to in years, calling me a disappointment and demanding that I do the right thing and take Haley in. My mother would show up at my bakery unannounced, sobbing in front of my customers, begging me to reconsider. My father left furious, threatening voicemails stating that if I didn't let Haley move in, he would make sure I was completely excised from the family tree. It was a coordinated, relentless siege designed to break my spirit and force my compliance. It was exhausting, deeply hurtful, and incredibly isolating. I spent many nights sitting alone on the floor of my beautiful new kitchen, crying into a towel, wondering if I was the bad person they said I was. But every time I looked around at the house I had earned, the granite countertops I had paid for, the quiet, safe space I had created, I found the strength to keep my boundaries locked down. I ignored the texts. I blocked the toxic relatives. I had my bakery staff turn my mother away when she tried to stage her public crying sessions. I stood my ground. Then came the betrayal that changed the entire trajectory of my life. About 2 months into the standoff, things went suspiciously quiet. The phone calls stopped. The unannounced visits ceased. I thought foolishly that they had finally given up and accepted my boundaries. I was looking forward to a peaceful weekend, working in my garden and enjoying my home. On a Tuesday afternoon, while I was elbow-deep in fondant at the bakery, my phone rang. It was an unrecognized number. I answered it, expecting a client. Instead, it was a representative from a massive, high-interest personal loan company. The representative was calling to verify some details on an application that had been submitted that morning. He casually mentioned that he needed to confirm my employment status and income for the $80,000 loan I was co-signing with my parents, using my new home as collateral. The world around me stopped spinning. My blood ran completely cold. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me so violently I had to grab the edge of the stainless steel counter to keep from collapsing. I asked the man to repeat what he had just said. He politely explained that an application had been submitted online, bearing my name, my social security number, and the deed information for my house, listing me as the primary guarantor for a massive debt consolidation loan taken out by my parents. They had forged my signature. They had stolen my identity. They were trying to secretly mortgage the home I had just bought to pay off Haley's debts and whatever other financial disasters they had created. I didn't panic. I went completely, terrifyingly numb. A strange, cold clarity washed over my brain. I calmly informed the representative that I had absolutely no knowledge of this application, that my signature had been forged, and that I was the victim of identity theft. I instructed him to freeze the application immediately and send me all the documentation they had received. The man on the phone, sensing the severity of the situation, complied instantly. He emailed me the entire file. I sat in the back office of my bakery, staring at the screen, looking at the crude digital forgery of my signature on a document that would have tied my life, my home, and my credit to my parents' endless black hole of debt. And then, as I read through the loan application details, I discovered the mid-story twist that completely shattered whatever lingering illusions I had about my family. The loan wasn't just to pay off Haley's back rent. The application required my parents to disclose their own financial status. As I scrolled through the attached documents, I saw the truth they had been hiding for years. My parents were completely, hopelessly bankrupt. They had taken out second and third mortgages on their own home to fund Haley's lifestyle. They had maxed out every credit card they could get their hands on. They were months behind on their own mortgage payments, and their house was in active pre-foreclosure. They weren't just trying to find a place for Haley to live. They were trying to steal my home's equity to save themselves, and when that failed, they were planning to lose their house and force all three of them to move in with me, effectively turning me into their permanent financial hostage. They hadn't just chosen Haley over me. They had chosen to sacrifice me entirely so they wouldn't have to face the consequences of their own actions. I didn't call them. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I picked up my phone and called a ruthless, highly recommended property and civil litigation lawyer. I spent the next 3 hours in his office, laying out the forged documents, the threatening voicemails, and the financial disclosures. He was appalled. He advised me to go to the police immediately and file a formal report for identity theft and fraud. He told me it was an open and shut case and that my parents could face serious prison time. But as I sat there, listening to him outline the legal process, a different plan began to form in my mind. A police report was quiet. A trial would take years. I didn't want a quiet resolution. I wanted them to feel a fraction of the humiliation, the betrayal, and the public exposure they had subjected me to for my entire life. My grandparents' 50th wedding anniversary was scheduled for the following weekend. It was the social event of the decade for my extended family. My parents had rented out a massive, expensive banquet hall at the local country club, likely paying for it with credit cards that were about to bounce. Everyone who had sent me hate texts, everyone who had judged me, everyone who thought my parents were saints and I was a monster, was going to be in that room. It was the perfect stage. I spent the rest of the week preparing. I worked with my lawyer to lock down my credit, secure my property deed behind a newly formed LLC, and ensure that my parents had absolutely zero access to any of my information. I gathered every piece of evidence, the forged loan documents, the foreclosure notices on their house, the eviction papers for Haley, and printed out massive, undeniable copies of all of them. I placed them neatly into a thick manila folder. I bought a stunning new dress. I got my hair done. I prepared to go to war. When I arrived at the banquet hall that Saturday evening, the atmosphere was exactly what I expected. The room was dripping in fake opulence. When I walked in, conversations literally stopped. Relatives glared at me. Aunts whispered behind their hands. My parents saw me from across the room, and their faces morphed into masks of smug satisfaction. They thought I had broken. They thought I was there to apologize and give them what they wanted. They walked over to me, Haley trailing behind them like a pampered shadow. My mother pulled me in for a tight, entirely performative hug, whispering in my ear, "I knew you'd come to your senses. We can talk about moving Haley's things into your place tomorrow." I just smiled, a cold, empty smile, and pulled away. About an hour into the evening, after the toasts to my grandparents were finished, my father decided to seize the moment. He walked up to the stage, tapped the microphone, and cleared his throat. The room quieted down. He gave a sickly sweet speech about family, about unity, and about overcoming hardships. He talked about how proud he was of his daughters, and then he turned his gaze directly to me. "Tonight is about family," my father announced, his voice booming over the speakers. "And I am so incredibly proud to announce that our family is coming together in a beautiful way. After a period of misunderstanding, my eldest daughter has graciously agreed to open her new home to her sister Haley to help her through a transition period. It is a testament to the love we have taught them and the sacrifices we make for our own." The relatives clapped politely, some of them giving me approving, condescending nods. Haley beamed, waving at the crowd like she had just won an Oscar. My mother wiped a fake tear from her eye. They were trying to trap me. They were trying to make the announcement public so that if I backed out, I would look like a monster in front of everyone we knew. It was the most manipulative, disgusting tactic I had ever witnessed, and it was exactly what I was waiting for. I didn't shrink away. I didn't look down. I picked up my thick manila folder from the table, stood up, and walked directly toward the stage. The clapping died down, replaced by a confused murmur. My father's smile faltered slightly as I approached him. I didn't ask for permission. I walked up the steps, reached out, and pulled the microphone from his hand. He was too stunned to stop me. I stood in the center of the stage, looking out at the sea of faces. The people who had judged me without knowing the truth. The sister who had leeched off my existence. The parents who had tried to destroy my future. My father is right about one thing, I started, my voice echoing off the high ceilings, steady and clear. Tonight is about family, it's about truth, and it's about transitions. But the transition he's talking about isn't happening. The silence in the room became heavy, suffocating. My father stepped toward me, his face flushing red. "What are you doing? Get off the stage." I ignored him, turning my attention entirely to the crowd. For the last 2 months, many of you have texted me, called me, and harassed me. You've been told a very specific story. You've been told that I am a selfish, wealthy brat refusing to help my struggling sister. You were told that I was letting her go homeless out of spite. I opened the folder. What you weren't told is the truth. I pulled out the first document. Haley isn't just struggling. Haley was evicted because she hasn't paid rent in 6 months, despite my parents completely funding her lifestyle. She is tens of thousands of dollars in debt because she refuses to get a job. I held the document up. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. But that isn't the worst part, I continued, my voice gaining momentum, drowning out my mother's sudden gasp. My parents didn't just ask me to house her. They demanded I give her my master bedroom, pay all her bills, and support her indefinitely while I continue to work full-time. When I refused, they didn't just get mad, they got desperate. I pulled out the thick stack of financial disclosures. My parents have been lying to all of you. They have been lying to me. They aren't the successful, generous people they pretend to be. They are completely bankrupt. They have taken out 3 mortgages on their house to pay for Haley's designer clothes and vacations. They are in active pre-foreclosure. They are losing their home next month. The banquet hall exploded into gasps. Aunts and uncles stared in absolute shock. My grandfather looked like he was going to pass out. My father lunged forward, trying to grab the microphone. "Shut your mouth! You lying little!" I stepped back, dodging his grasp, and pulled out the final piece of paper. The undeniable proof. And when they realized they were losing everything, I yelled over the rising commotion. They decided to steal from me. 3 days ago, my parents submitted an $80,000 loan application using my home as collateral. They forged my signature. They stole my identity. They tried to secretly mortgage the home I spent 10 years working for to pay off the debts they accumulated, spoiling my sister. They tried to ruin my life to save themselves. I threw the forged documents onto the floor in front of my father. They scattered across the stage like dead leaves. "I didn't come here to agree to anything," I said, staring directly into my father's terrified, pale face. "I came here to deliver a message. I have frozen my credit. My house is legally protected in an LLC. I have already met with a lawyer, and the police have a copy of that forged application. The only reason I haven't pressed felony fraud charges yet is because I wanted to look you in the eye and tell you, in front of everyone, that you are dead to me." My mother let out a horrific, wailing sob, collapsing into a chair near the front table. Haley was standing perfectly still, her face drained of all color, staring at the foreclosure notices I had dropped on the stage, finally realizing that the bank of Mom and Dad was officially closed forever. The relatives were in an absolute uproar. My uncle, who had sent me the most vicious texts, stood up and yelled at my father, demanding to know if it was true. The illusion was shattered. The perfect family was exposed as a desperate, criminal fraud. "You chose her," I said to my parents, my voice dropping to a low, intense tone that the microphone picked up perfectly. "You always chose her. You spoiled her until she was useless. You enabled her until you were bankrupt, and you tried to sacrifice me to fix it. Well, congratulations. You get to keep her. But you get to keep her on the streets because you have absolutely nothing left, and you are never getting another dime from me." I dropped the microphone. It hit the wooden stage with a loud, piercing feedback screech that made half the room cover their ears. I didn't wait for a response. I didn't stay to watch the fallout. I walked down the steps, my head held high, and walked straight through the center of the room. The crowd parted for me. Nobody said a word to me. Nobody tried to stop me. When I pushed open the heavy double doors and stepped out into the cool night air of the country club parking lot, I felt a physical weight lift off my chest. My hands were shaking, my heart was pounding, but I could finally breathe. The aftermath was catastrophic for them and utterly liberating for me. I completely blocked every member of my family. I changed my number. I upgraded the security on my house. Through the grapevine, mostly from a cousin who reached out to deeply apologize for believing the lies, I learned the rest of the story. My parents' house was foreclosed on a month later. The bank took everything. Because I had exposed the fraud publicly, the extended family refused to lend them a single dollar. My aunts and uncle, disgusted by what my parents had tried to do to me, turned their backs on them completely. My parents and Haley were forced to move into a tiny 2-bedroom apartment in a terrible part of town. Haley, completely stripped of her funding and her delusions, was finally forced to get a minimum wage job working the graveyard shift at a gas station just to help them pay rent. The stress and the poverty completely destroyed their dynamic. My parents blame Haley for draining their finances, and Haley blames my parents for not stealing my money faster. They are trapped in a miserable, toxic hell of their own creation. As for me, I have never been better. My bakery expanded to a second location last year. I spend my weekends hosting dinners in my beautiful kitchen for my chosen family, my friends, my loyal staff, and the people who actually love and respect me. I sleep peacefully every single night, knowing that my home is safe, my future is secure, and that letting go of the people who tried to destroy me was the greatest thing I ever did. They wanted to take everything I had. Instead, I gave them exactly what they deserved: each other.